the stone is cool beneath his feet. It has been cool since before the sun cleared the eastern hills, since before the first cart arrived with its load of salted fish and dried figs, since before the city was anything more than a few lamps moving in the dark. Socrates has walked this same ground for so many years that the soles of his feet know its texture, the way a hand knows a familiar object in a dark room, the slight rise near the stoa, the dip where water pools after rain, the place where two paving stones meet at an angle that catches the unwary. He is not young, he has not been young for a long time, but his step carries him forward with the unhurried steadiness of a man who has nowhere to be except exactly where he is. This is Athens in the years when Athens believed itself to be the model of everything a city could become. The walls are solid, the harbor at Piraeus is full of ships. The long construction projects that Pericles set in motion on the Acropolis above the city are producing something extraordinary, a temple whose proportions seem less like human calculation than like the visible expression of an idea about what human achievement might reach toward. The Parthenon is not yet old. Its marble is pale and bright in the morning light, almost too bright to look at directly, and its columns cast clean shadows on the stone below. From certain streets in the lower city, if the angle is right and the air is clear, a person can look up and see it against the sky and feel, briefly, that they are living inside something that will last. Below it, in the wide open ground of the agora, the day is beginning its ordinary commerce. A merchant from the eastern islands is arranging his stock of dried herbs in careful rows, each bundle labeled by a system known only to him. A potter has arrived early with a cartload of vessels and is stacking them against the wall of a stoa, the clay still carrying the faint smell of the kiln. Two men are arguing near the central altar, not philosophically, not about justice or the good, but about the price of wool, and they are arguing with the complete absorption of men for whom this particular disagreement is, this morning, the most important thing in the world. A woman with a basket on her arm moves through the market with the practiced navigation of someone who has done this walk 1,000 times, knowing which stalls will have what she needs and which vendors are likely to give her a fair price. Dogs. The sound of bronze being struck somewhere at the edge of the square, the smell of bread from a baker who rose before the light. Into this world carrying nothing, wearing no shoes, Socrates walks. He is not remarkable to look at. He is famously not remarkable to look at, broad and a little stocky, with a face that the people who wrote about him struggled to describe with any kindness. A flat nose, heavy brows, the sort of face that causes strangers to underestimate what is happening behind it. He wears a simple garment, the same kind any man of modest means would wear, and his feet are bare, not because he has forgotten his sandals, but because he has never bothered with them, or at least has never found them important enough to bother with consistently. He carries no writing tablets. He carries no fee from yesterday's students, because there are no students and there are no fees. He is not going anywhere in particular. He is going to the place where people are, because people are the only thing he has ever found inexhaustible. His father was a stonemason. This is not a detail to pass over quickly. The stonemason's workshop is a place of specific knowledge, the knowledge of grain and weight and the way marble responds to different tools, the knowledge of how a block behaves under a chisel, and how much force is required to split stone cleanly versus leaving it ragged. It is practical knowledge, knowledge that can be tested immediately against the evidence of the stone itself, knowledge where being wrong has visible and sometimes painful consequences. Socrates grew up around that kind of knowing. He knew from early life what it looks like when a man genuinely possesses a skill, when the work itself confirms the understanding, when the craftsman's hand and the material cooperate, because the craftsman has earned the cooperation through long practice. His mother was a midwife. She knew a different kind of knowledge, the knowledge of how to assist something that is already happening, how to be present at the emergence of something new without interfering with the process that makes the emergence possible. Both of these inheritances would matter. Both would show up in ways that are not accidental in the shape of what he chose to do with his life. What he chose to do was ask questions in public places. The Agora was the right place for this, and Socrates seems to have understood why, without needing to theorize about it. The Agora was not a place of withdrawal. It was not a courtyard belonging to a private school where select students gathered around a teacher who had something to impart. It was the center of the city's economic and political and legal life all at once, a place where contracts were made and disputes were heard and citizens voted and merchants traded and information moved from person to person in the way information has always moved. When many people occupy a shared space and are not trying to ignore each other, to conduct philosophy in the Agora was to insist that philosophy was not separate from life, not an elevated pursuit reserved for those with the leisure to pursue it, not something that happened in a separate room after the serious business of the day had been attended to. It was a statement, made by feet on ground, that the questions worth asking are continuous with the questions that arise in the ordinary traffic of an ordinary day. The city that produced this statement was in certain respects the most unusual political arrangement the ancient world had yet seen. The reforms introduced by Cleisthenes a century before Socrates was born had restructured Athenian political life in ways that still sound, from a distance, startling, redistributing political units to cut across the old tribal and geographic loyalties, creating a council chosen partly by lot, establishing the principle that political decisions should be made not by birth or wealth alone, but by the assembled judgment of citizens meeting together. Pericles had deepened and extended this arrangement, and by the middle of the 5th century, Athens was operating under something genuinely novel, a democracy in which the assembly of citizens held real power and exercised it, in which any freeborn male citizen could in principle stand up and speak, and in which the collective verdict of that assembled body was treated as sovereign. This created something Socrates found himself unable to stop examining. The system rested on a claim that the judgment of the assembled citizenry, collectively and through open debate, was capable of making good decisions about how the city should be governed, and what it should value, and what it should do. This was not a small claim, it was a very large one, and Socrates, walking barefoot through the Agora past the people who exercised this collective sovereignty, found himself returning again and again to a single question that the system did not ask about itself. Did the citizens actually know what they thought they knew? The politicians who rose in the assembly to speak about justice, had they examined what justice was? The generals who proposed military expeditions, confident in their understanding of what victory required and what risk was acceptable, had they seriously asked themselves what courage and wisdom looked like in a particular situation, rather than assuming they already possessed them? The poets whose works the city honored as vessels of moral instruction, had they interrogated whether what they taught was actually true, or were they, like everyone else, articulating received assumptions while believing them to be hard-won knowledge? These were not comfortable questions. They were asked by a man who did not appear to be proposing an alternative system. He was not, as far as anyone could tell, arguing for oligarchy or tyranny or any other arrangement. He seemed to be asking only whether the current system had examined its own foundations, whether the democracy of collective judgment had ever seriously questioned whether the collective actually possessed the judgment it claimed. In a city that prized public rhetoric and political confidence and the appearance of civic authority, this was a peculiar thing to keep asking. In a city about to undergo decades of war and the particular kind of moral strain that prolonged war produces, it would become a stranger and more charged question still. The Peloponnesian War began when Socrates was in his 30s. It continued, with intervals for nearly 30 years, which means it coincided almost exactly with the period when his philosophical activity was at its most intensive, when he was most consistently present in the agora, asking his careful questions of anyone willing to engage. This is worth holding in mind as a piece of background texture, not as a dramatic overlay. The war was not to the Athenians living through its early years the catastrophe it would retrospectively appear. Athens was confident. Athens had the long walls connecting the city to the harbor, which meant it could be supplied by sea, while Sparta ravaged the countryside. Athens had the Delian League and the tribute it generated. Athens had, or believed it had, a strategic position that would allow it to outlast any Spartan assault on its territory. What Athens did not have was certainty about how to conduct itself in a conflict that lasted longer than anyone had planned for, and required choices that became progressively harder to defend in terms of the values the city publicly professed. Expeditions were launched, alliances were made and broken. The treatment of defeated populations, Mytilene, Melos, raised questions about the relationship between power and justice that the Democratic Assembly debated with genuine seriousness and then answered in ways that required each subsequent generation to decide what to make of. The plague came during the second year of the war and killed a significant portion of the city's population, including, eventually, Pericles. None of this appears to have stopped Socrates from walking to the agora and asking his questions with the same patient attention he brought to ordinary days. Even when the Sicilian expedition was proposed, it was proposed with confidence. Athens had assembled a fleet that seemed to many of its citizens like an expression of invincibility, something so overwhelming in its size and the military power it represented that the operation could not possibly fail. Thucydides, who was watching all of this happen and writing it down with the cool attention of a man determined to understand rather than celebrate, noticed that the confidence itself was part of the problem. The enthusiasm was real. The intelligence about Sicily was thin. The scale of the ambition was not matched by a clear account of what success would look like or how it would be achieved. The fleet sailed. The news of its destruction came back slowly, the way bad news from great distances always came back, in fragments, each fragment carrying something that the next one made worse, until the full picture assembled itself in the city's understanding, and it became clear that the greatest naval force Athens had sent out had been annihilated in the harbor of Syracuse. The ships were gone, the soldiers were gone, the generals were dead or captured. The thing that had seemed like an expression of Athenian invincibility had ended in a catastrophe that made invincibility appear, in retrospect, like one more confident assumption that had not been carefully examined before being acted upon. And somewhere in the streets of Athens, Socrates continued his conversations. He asked the same questions. He walked the same ground. The city around him was different, more anxious, more politically volatile, less certain of itself. But the questions did not change. What is courage? What does it mean to know something rather than merely to believe it? What is justice? Not as an institution, but as something a person might actually possess as a quality of their character. The urgency of these questions was not invented by Socrates. It was given to them by the situation the city was living through. When the confident assumption of military genius leads to catastrophe, the question of whether anyone actually possesses the knowledge they claim to possess becomes harder to set aside. The last years of the war produced something worse than the Sicilian disaster, if only because it was inflicted from inside. Sparta's eventual victory brought the city to its knees and installed briefly a regime of 30 oligarchs who proceeded to govern with a thoroughness of cruelty that Athenians would spend the next generation trying to come to terms with. The law courts were suspended. The democratic assembly was dissolved. The political institutions that Athenians had understood as the defining feature of their civic life, the institutions that distinguished their city from others, that gave their form of self-governance its particular pride, were simply set aside, as though they had always been provisional, as though everything the city had built itself on could be unmade in an afternoon by men with the right backers and sufficient ruthlessness. The 30 tyrants, as they came to be called, held the city for 8 months. Athenians whose names appeared on lists were killed. Medics, foreign residents who had built lives in the city, were targeted for their property. The philosopher was in the city through all of this. He had been in the city through the war. He had served as a soldier, as citizens were called to serve, with a physical steadiness that other soldiers later remembered as remarkable. He had once, in the middle of a military campaign, stood still in the cold through an entire night working through some question that had caught his attention, still standing at sunrise when the other soldiers came to look at him, as though the external cold were simply not a variable that his thinking needed to account for. This was not performance. It was the outward sign of something that had settled very deeply in him, something about what mattered and what did not, something about the relationship between the conditions of the body and the work of the mind. He was not executed by the 30, though they gave him an order during their brief reign that he declined to follow, an order to participate in the arrest of a man whose arrest was clearly unjust. He declined, went home, and waited to see what would happen. What happened was that the democracy was restored, the 30 were overthrown, and Athens settled into the complicated business of rebuilding its civic life after a period of violent internal betrayal. A reconciliation was formalized. There was to be no official remembering of grievances. The city was to move forward. It moved forward, and Socrates continued to walk in its streets. It is worth pausing for a moment on what Athens looked like in the years after the Restoration, not as a political situation, but as a city that had been through something and was still living with what had been through it. The buildings were there, the market was there, the Acropolis and the Parthenon were there, the marble still paler and brighter than any marble would be for very long, before the centuries began their patient work of weathering and staining. The potters and merchants and craftsmen were at their stalls. The harbor at Piraeus was again full of ships. But underneath the visible resumption of ordinary life, there was a city trying to understand what it had been through and what it meant, and whether the values it had publicly professed were values it could be said to actually hold, given everything that had happened. Into this situation, Socrates carried his questions with the same patient care he had always brought to them. This was not, or at least need not be read as, an act of defiance. It was something closer to the expression of a very deep consistency, the kind of consistency that comes not from stubbornness, but from having genuinely examined one's own life and arrived at a settled understanding of what matters and what does not. He did not adjust his method to the political climate. He did not make his questions easier or more palatable in the aftermath of everything the city had been through. He continued to ask whether the people he encountered actually knew what they thought they knew, whether the confidence with which Athenians spoke about virtue and justice and wisdom corresponded to any genuine possession of those things, whether the life any given person was living had ever been seriously examined, or whether it was simply the result of accumulated habit and unquestioned assumption. This is the world, then, that produced him and that he moved through for his entire adult life, a world of democratic institutions that genuinely mattered, of political confidence that sometimes outran the wisdom required to justify it, of war and its consequences, of a city that had been tested severely and had emerged still standing, but marked. The stone of the agora bore the footprints of all of it. The arguments that happened in the colonnaded stoas, the legal proceedings that assembled juries of 500 citizens in the open air, the commercial transactions and civic debates, and informal conversations that made up the texture of daily Athenian life. All of it was continuous with the conversation Socrates was having, not because he was commenting on current events or addressing the political situation directly, but because the questions he was asking were exactly the questions that the political situation was making unavoidable for anyone paying honest attention. Consider what it meant for a jury of 500 citizens to assemble in the open air of the agora for a legal proceeding. Each man held a token representing his vote. The scale of the thing was visible, not delegated to representatives, not filtered through any institutional buffer, but direct and present and collective. 500 people, their judgment assembled into a single verdict. The system was the system Athens had chosen, and it took its own authority seriously. It was the same system that had, in its various iterations, voted for the Sicilian expedition, and voted for the Million Dialogue's brutal conclusion, and voted for other things that seemed, at the time, like expressions of collective wisdom, and appeared in retrospect as something more complicated. The question of whether 500 citizens, however sincere, actually possessed the knowledge their vote required. This was not an abstract question in Athens. It was visible every time the agora filled with people making decisions about the city they shared. The city also produced, in these same decades, some of the most extraordinary artistic and intellectual work the ancient world would see. Sophocles was writing his tragedies, dramas in which the relationship between human knowledge and human limitation was not a philosophical puzzle, but a living thing that could be felt in the theater, in the body, in the specific grief of watching a figure who was intelligent and sincere arrive at catastrophe because their understanding was incomplete in ways they could not see. Thucydides was watching the war and writing about it with a discipline that looked, from the outside, like cold detachment, but was actually something more, like the discipline of a man determined not to let his own hopes and fears distort the record of what actually happened, because the record of what actually happened was the only honest material available for understanding human affairs. These projects and Socrates' project were not the same, but they were all, in their different ways, taking seriously the same question. What do human beings actually know, and what do they only believe they know, and what follows from the difference? It would be wrong to say that Socrates was the voice his city needed in order to ask this question. The city was asking it in many ways at once, but Socrates was the person who made the asking into a daily practice and a public one, who carried the question through the streets and into the market and into the conversations that happened between merchants and citizens, and craftsmen and aristocrats, and young men and generals, as they went about the business of ordinary Athenian life. He was not above the city. He was not commenting on it from a position of superior knowledge. He was inside it, barefoot, carrying nothing, asking the same question with the same patient attention he had been bringing to it for 40 years. His position was distinctive in a specific way. The sophists, the professional teachers of rhetoric and argumentation, who charged significant fees for their instruction and had students who attended their lectures in a formal sense, occupied a recognizable social role. They were paid. Their students were typically the sons of wealthy families who could afford the fees and who expected, in return, a kind of political training that would make them effective in the assembly and the law courts. The sophists taught persuasion. They taught how to argue effectively for any position, how to deploy language in ways that moved an audience toward a desired conclusion. Some of them were genuinely brilliant. Some of what they taught was valuable. But the orientation of their work was toward winning, toward the successful performance of argumentation, rather than the honest examination of what was true. Socrates took no money. This was not an oversight or an expression of asceticism for its own sake. It was the expression of a view about what he was doing and what relationship that created between him and the people he spoke with. The moment money changes hands in a philosophical encounter, the encounter changes. The one who pays expects something in return, a service, an instruction, some positive transfer of knowledge or skill. The teacher is positioned as a person with something to give. Socrates was not interested in being that person, partly because he genuinely did not believe he had positive knowledge to give, and partly because he thought the relationship between teacher and student, properly understood, was not a transfer at all, but something more like a collaboration in which the student was doing most of the real work, and the philosopher's role was to ask the question that made the work necessary. To be born to a stonemason and a midwife, and to walk barefoot through a marketplace where wealthy men received wealthy sophists in private houses and charged considerable sums for sophisticated education. This placed Socrates in a genuinely unusual position. He was not aristocratic. He was not wealthy. He was not a professional. He was not in any institutional sense a teacher. He was a citizen of Athens who happened to believe that the most important thing a person could do with their time was ask careful questions about whether the lives they were living made sense, and who further believed that the best place to do this was in the open, among people who had not arranged their morning around philosophy, who were carrying their groceries or heading to a legal proceeding or arguing about wool prices, and who could, if a conversation caught their interest, stop for a while and think together about something that mattered. The agora was built for this, even if that was not what it was built for. Its physical design, the colonnaded walkways of the stoas, the open central space, the mixture of civic and commercial functions, created conditions in which many kinds of conversation were already happening, in which strangers addressed each other, in which the distance between public business and private thought was kept deliberately small. Socrates did not require a special room. He did not require special listeners. He required only the ordinary traffic of the city and the willingness of the person nearest to him to stop for a few minutes or a few hours and engage with a question honestly. Philosophers would come after him who built schools, proper schools with fees and courses and organized teaching programs. Plato would build one, eventually, in the grove of Academos outside the city walls, and the academy would last for centuries. Aristotle would establish another. These were serious institutions that produced serious work, but they were also, by their nature, places of some separation from the ordinary world, places where philosophy happened among people who had arranged their lives to make room for it. Socrates had always worked against this separation, whether or not he thought about it in those terms. His classroom was the marketplace. His students were people who had not signed up to be students. His method did not require a student to know in advance that they were about to do philosophy. It only required that they be willing to answer a question. Usually they were willing. Usually the first question seemed simple enough, a question about what they believed, what they valued, what they thought they understood. The craftsmen had their craft, the generals had their victories, the politicians had their speeches, the poets had their verses. Everyone had something they were confident they understood, something they could speak about with fluency and ease. Socrates would listen to the confident answer with genuine attention. He would nod. He would ask a second question, smaller and more specific than the first, and the conversation would continue. And somewhere in the middle of an ordinary morning, in the same square where olives were being sold and legal proceedings were being convened, and the whole ordinary machinery of city life was running at its usual speed, a person who had walked in confident of something would find themselves uncertain in a way they had not been before, and whether that uncertainty was a gift or a grievance depended entirely on how you understood what you were looking for. The sun has moved now. The morning's first transactions are giving way to the fuller business of midday. The merchants have settled into their rhythms. The legal proceedings that began at dawn have progressed to the point where verdicts are beginning to emerge. The potter's vessels are still stacked against the stoa wall, and a few have been sold. The dogs have found shade. Somewhere in the square, or in one of the colonnaded walkways that border it, a conversation is still going. 2 men, or 3, have set aside the morning's practical business long enough to follow a question somewhere it had not been expected to go. The question was about something ordinary, justice or courage, or what it means to know something, and it turned out, once followed carefully, to be anything but ordinary. This is what the agora was, on any given morning, in the years when Socrates was alive. A place of commerce and civic procedure and legal machinery and informal gathering, a place where the full range of Athenian public life conducted itself in the open air, under the same sky, on the same ground, and also because one man had decided that the questions worth asking are continuous with the lives people are actually living, a place where philosophy was not a separate thing from the morning's work, but woven into it, present in the pause between transactions, in the conversation that began with a greeting and became almost by accident an hour of honest thought. The marble above the city is still bright. The market noise rises and settles and rises again. The same stone that has been cool since before the sun came up is warming now under the late morning light, holding the heat in the way stone does, slowly, without hurry, accumulating warmth, the way a question accumulates meaning, when the same honest attention has been brought to it for long enough. The most important questions have always been asked in ordinary places, among people going about their days, in the same world where bread is sold and legal tokens are counted and ships are unloaded at the harbor. They do not require a special room. They have never required a special room. They have never required a special room. They require only the willingness to stop for a moment in the middle of the ordinary world and take seriously what is worth taking seriously. A general is arriving at the agora on a bright morning, and he carries himself the way men do who have made consequential decisions and found that the decisions held. His name is not recorded in the dialogues. What is recorded is his certainty, the particular physical certainty of a man who has commanded armies and watched those commands move through hundreds of soldiers, like wind through a field of grain. He knows what courage is. He has practiced it, measured it in others, rewarded it with commendation, and punished its absence with consequence. And so, when a barefoot man, stocky and unhurried, with eyes that seem faintly amused by something no one else can see, falls into step beside him and says, simply, without preface, that he has always wanted to understand courage, and wonders whether the general might help him. The general slows his pace and agrees. This is not a difficult question. He is well qualified to answer it. The conversation begins the way most conversations about courage begin. Courage is standing your ground in battle. Courage is facing danger without flinching. Courage is the thing that holds a line of soldiers firm when every instinct in a human body is pressing them to run. These are good answers. They come from lived experience and command a kind of immediate authority that abstract argument rarely carries. And Socrates listens, genuinely, with the still attention of someone who has not yet decided what the answer is, and then, when the general finishes, asks one small, quiet question. What about the Scythians, who charge into battle rather than hold position, and who are also said to be brave? What about the soldier who retreats in order to fight more effectively later? Is he being cowardly, or does his retreat require a particular kind of fortitude? The general pauses. He considers. He begins to feel that his answer, which seemed solid a moment ago, has a gap in it that he had not previously noticed. He adjusts the answer. Socrates asks another question, equally patient, equally small. Another adjustment follows. After a while, the general notices that the thing he began with, the clear, practical definition that any soldier would recognize, has become something strange and slippery, and that he is no longer certain he knows what it refers to. This is where most conversations end. The general would like to excuse himself. He has duties this morning, but Socrates does not press him. The strangeness that has opened between them was not placed there by pressure or argument. It was already in the concept, waiting to be found, and the questions were only what brought it into view. That strangeness has a name. The word for it, in the Greek that Socrates spoke, is aporia. It carries no drama in the original. It means, at its simplest, an impasse, a path that has been followed and found, at a certain point, not to continue in the direction the traveler expected. Socrates used it often. He arrived at it regularly, not as an accident, but as a destination, not because he was careless with arguments, but because he was careful with them, careful enough to follow them until they honestly stopped. And the stopping, he maintained, was not failure, it was the point. To understand why, it helps to notice what the general was carrying before the conversation began. He carried an assumption, not a vague hunch, but something with the solidity of fact, something he would have offered if challenged and expected everyone around him to accept. The assumption was that he knew what courage was, not in the narrow sense of being able to say the word correctly, but in the full sense of possessing understanding adequate to the thing itself. When he taught his soldiers what to do under pressure, when he praised or condemned a man's behavior in combat, when he made decisions that required him to weigh the value of risk against the value of ground, in all of these moments, he was acting on that assumption, and it had not been examined. Not once, perhaps, in a long career of acting on it. What the conversation with Socrates produced was not the replacement of that assumption with a better one. What it produced was the sudden visibility of the assumption as an assumption, the strange and vertiginous experience of watching something that had functioned as bedrock reveal itself to be a working hypothesis that had never been tested. That visibility is aporia, and Socrates held that this experience, uncomfortable as it is worth more than all the confident answers that preceded it, because the confident answers were carrying something false, the unearned certainty that understanding had been achieved, while the aporia carries something honest, the accurate recognition that a question has not yet been answered. There is a difference, and it matters, between the man who has never thought about courage and the man who has thought about it carefully and reached aporia. Both cannot say what courage is, but they are not in the same condition. The first man holds a word and takes it for a thing. The second has followed the word into its territory and understood through the traveling why the obvious landmarks do not point where he thought they did. His uncertainty is informed. It has been earned through a specific intellectual journey, and that journey is itself a kind of knowledge, not knowledge of what courage is, but knowledge of the shape of the difficulty, the places where the definitions break, the questions that any adequate answer would need to address. Socrates described his own position in these terms. He did not claim to know what courage was either. He had spent decades asking the question. The difference between him and the general at the start of their conversation was not that Socrates possessed an answer he was withholding. The difference was that Socrates already knew, intimately, the territory through which the general was about to travel. He knew which paths ended in contradiction, and which seemed solid for a while longer before quietly failing, and he knew this not because he had been told about them, but because he had walked every one of them himself, over many years, and kept careful attention to where the ground gave way. In the Apology, the account of Socrates speaking in his own defense, he describes a period in which he moved through Athens visiting the men considered wisest by their fellow citizens, politicians, poets, craftsmen, each accomplished in their domain. He came to each of them because of a declaration by the oracle at Delphi, which had said, when someone asked, that no one was wiser than Socrates. This puzzled him. He did not consider himself wise. He had no positive knowledge of great matters to point to. He set out to disprove the oracle by finding someone wiser than himself. What he found instead was that the politicians, for all their facility with civic argument, believed they understood justice and the good city, when in fact they did not. The poets, for all their beautiful making, could not explain the principles behind what they made. The craftsmen were genuinely skilled in their crafts. Here Socrates granted real knowledge, but this had led them to believe they understood other things as well, large things, things outside their domain, things that their skill in working wood or bronze had given them no particular access to. In each case, the pattern was the same. Real competence in one area had been silently extended into assumed competence in areas where it did not apply, and the assumption had never been subjected to scrutiny because no one had asked the right questions. What Socrates found himself saying, after enough of these encounters, was that he did seem to be slightly wiser than these men in one respect. They did not know what they did not know, and he did. His ignorance, at least, was held with awareness. Theirs was compounded by the false belief that it was knowledge. This is not, when it arrives in full weight, a comfortable idea. It asks something of whoever holds it. It asks the willingness to sit with a question that has no comfortable resting place, to carry an awareness of one's own ignorance as a permanent condition rather than a temporary embarrassment to be resolved before the next conversation. Most people, encountering aporia, want to move through it quickly. They want the confusion to be a doorway to a better answer, and soon Socrates offered no such promise. He sat in the aporia with the same patience he brought to everything else, and his manner in sitting there suggested that the sitting was itself a kind of philosophical attainment, not a failure of thinking, but evidence that thinking had been taken seriously enough to reach its honest limits. There is a metaphor he used for his own practice that illuminates this posture. His mother, Fanarit, was a midwife. He returned to this fact more than once, not as biography, but as image. A midwife does not implant life in the women she attends. What is growing grows in them. What is born is theirs. The midwife's skill is a skill of attending, of reading the process, of knowing when to assist and how, of trusting the labor to proceed through its own logic, while being present to it with competent, unhurried care. She does not give birth on anyone's behalf. She stays close and allows the birth to happen as it will. Socrates held that his conversations worked in something like this way. He did not arrive at a dialogue with philosophical conclusions prepared in advance, waiting to be transferred into his interlocutor's mind. What he arrived with was the practice of questioning, the capacity to ask carefully and follow the answers honestly. And through that practice, he believed he could help people give birth to ideas that were already latent in them, already forming, already pressing toward articulation. The understanding he was looking for was not something he possessed and could deliver. It was something that could be found together in the space of honest inquiry if both parties were willing to follow the argument wherever it honestly led. The word for this kind of practice in the Greek philosophical tradition is maieutic, from the word for midwifery. It carries a particular respect for the interlocutor that is easy to miss if the dialogues are read only as Socrates defeating people in argument. He is not defeating them, he is attending them. He is staying close to the process of their thinking and asking the questions that allow that thinking to advance, even when, especially when, the advance is into uncertainty rather than resolution. A sophist would have done something different entirely. In the Agora of Athens, brilliant men traveled from city to city, teaching rhetoric for payment, and they were good at what they did. They could take an audience and move it, through well-placed argument, through appeals that landed with emotional precision, through the performance of confidence in ideas, whose foundations they had no particular interest in examining. The best of them were not cynical. They believed in the power of persuasion, in the value of equipping people with the tools to argue their positions effectively in democratic assemblies and courts of law. These were practical goods. Athens ran on them, but Socrates drew a distinction between this and what he was doing, and the distinction was not merely technical. Rhetoric, as he understood the sophists' practice, aimed at producing belief, specifically the belief the speaker wanted the audience to hold. The question of whether that belief was true, whether the argument on which it rested would survive careful examination, whether the mind being persuaded would be any clearer after the persuasion than before. These questions were, for the rhetorician, beside the point. The point was conviction. The point was the audience walking away, prepared to vote as the speaker had intended. Dialogue, the kind Socrates practiced, aimed at something different. It aimed at the emergence of whatever was actually true about the question, regardless of whose starting position that truth confirmed or challenged. Which meant it aimed at something no rhetorician could promise, because the rhetorician knew the destination before the journey began. A sophist speaks brilliantly before an assembled crowd somewhere in the agora, his periods rounding into one another with practiced fluency, the audience shifting and nodding with the movements of the argument, feeling something that resembles conviction because it has been carefully shaped to feel that way. And a few streets away, Socrates is sitting with one person, asking one question, following the answer wherever it honestly leads. There is no crowd for the second conversation. There is no performance. There is only the slow movement of two minds through a territory neither fully controls, looking at the question together. The question might be about justice, it might be about piety, or virtue, or what it means to say that something is beautiful. It might begin with a confident claim from the person Socrates is speaking with, a claim that has the ring of settled knowledge, that this person has repeated before without difficulty and never found anyone to contest it. Socrates repeats it back, making sure he has understood correctly. He usually has, and then he asks one question, not a destabilizing question, not a sophist trick designed to produce confusion for its own sake. A genuine question, arising from the claim itself, about a case the claim might not have accounted for, or about the meaning of a word on which the claim depends, or about the assumption that makes the claim seem self-evidently true. Just one question, patient, curious, without apparent agenda. What follows is not always comfortable for the person being questioned. Socrates knew this. He was under no illusions about the social cost of what he was doing, and he was aware that the interlocutors who felt most exposed by the process were often those with the most public investment in being seen to know, politicians who had staked their authority on their grasp of justice, religious officials who had built their standing on their understanding of piety, teachers who had accepted payment to teach virtue to other people's sons. For all of these, arriving at aporia in front of a witness was not an abstract intellectual experience. It carried weight. It landed in the places where reputation lived. He did not apologize for this, but he did hold a view about it, a view that once heard changes slightly the texture of how the dialogues feel. Socrates maintained that he was not doing these men harm by questioning them. He was, if anything, offering them something that no amount of unexamined confidence could provide, the accurate picture of their own understanding, including its limits. To know that you do not know is to be positioned to do something about the not knowing, to inquire further, to hold your assumptions with appropriate looseness, to make decisions with an awareness of the uncertainty in which those decisions are grounded. To believe you know, while not knowing, is to be sealed off from all of this, and Socrates held that this sealing off was a deeper damage than any discomfort his questions might produce. He had a phrase for what the oracle's declaration meant after his long investigation. His wisdom, such as it was human wisdom, the kind available to anyone willing to look honestly at what they know and do not know, without inflating one into the other. It was not a claim to exceptional insight. It was a claim about the importance of accuracy in self-assessment and what accuracy in self-assessment actually requires, which is sustained practice rather than a single moment of honest reckoning. The question he always returned to was simple enough to state in a sentence and deep enough to occupy a lifetime. What do I actually understand, and what do I merely believe I understand? Not as a rhetorical exercise, not as a performance of philosophical humility for the benefit of an audience, but as a daily practice of honest examination applied to the things he was most confident about, in the moments when the confidence felt most solid and unassailable. That practice was the method, and the method was not a tool he picked up and put down. It was the way he moved through the world. The geometric problem is solved in the sand, and it is worth pausing there a moment, because this image carries something that the dialogues with generals and politicians do not quite show. An uneducated boy, a slave, in the Platonic text, is brought into conversation about a geometric problem that he has never studied. He does not know mathematics as a discipline. He has had no instruction in the relevant theorems. Fairm and count, that measures knowledge as accumulated information delivered from outside, he should have nothing useful to offer. And yet, when Socrates questions him, carefully, one step at a time, asking only what he sees in front of him and whether it follows, the boy arrives, slowly and through his own reasoning, at a geometric truth. He has not been told it, he has found it. The finding was guided by questions, but the reasoning was his own. This was not for Socrates a curiosity or a demonstration of a teaching trick. It was a piece of evidence for something he found genuinely strange and important about the structure of human understanding. The capacity to reason well was not something the privileged few possessed, and the rest lacked. It was not purchased by education in the way that a skill could be purchased by instruction. Something in it was already there, in the boy tracing figures in the sand, in the general who had never been asked to examine his assumptions, in the craftsman whose expertise had grown comfortable with its own limits. The questioning did not put the reasoning there. The questioning found it, called it forward, gave it enough space and enough friction to make itself visible. This is what distinguishes a midwife from a teacher, in the sense Socrates meant the distinction. A teacher deposits knowledge. A midwife attends what is already in labor, for the method that Socrates practiced was designed for the second task, not to fill minds that were empty, but to attend carefully to minds that were already thinking, often without knowing it, and to ask the questions that would bring what was forming in them into full light. There is a man standing at the edge of Aporia, and he has been there a while now. He came to this conversation knowing what he knew, and now the knowing has softened in a way he cannot quite reverse, and he is holding the question he came with in both hands without the certainty he carried into the morning. He is not empty. He has not lost anything he genuinely possessed. What he has lost is only the comfortable sensation of possessing something he did not quite have. And in the space where that sensation was, there is now something else, smaller, cooler, quieter, and more honest, an awareness that the question remains open, an awareness that he has traveled through its territory and come to know the shape of its difficulty, an awareness that this is not the end of thinking, but the place from which thinking that is genuinely serious can begin. Whether this awareness makes him lighter or heavier depends, perhaps, on how he is carrying it. Socrates seemed to find it light. Decades of practice had made the open question feel less like a burden and more like a companion, something that walked alongside him through the agora and the gymnasium and the dinner parties, patient and unhurried, not demanding resolution, content to be attended. He was not, by all accounts, a gloomy man. The descriptions that survive, from Plato, from Xenophon, from the portrait that emerges through the texture of the dialogues themselves, suggest someone who found the practice of inquiry pleasurable in a specific way, the way any deep engagement with a genuinely interesting question is pleasurable, even when the question is hard and the answers are elusive. Especially then, perhaps. The man at the edge of Aporia will likely leave the conversation and return to his morning. He has business to attend to, and the city is busy around him. He may or may not return to the question. He may find in the days that follow that the conversation has left something in him that was not there before, a slight loosening of certainty in places he had not previously examined, a tendency to pause where he would once have spoken confidently, a noticing of the gap between what he knows and what he assumes. Or he may not notice any of this. He may close the conversation in his memory and carry on exactly as before, his assumptions intact, the morning's strangeness set aside. Socrates did not seem troubled by either outcome. He would find another conversation in the afternoon, in a different corner of the agora, with someone who also believed they knew what they knew. He would begin again with the same patience and the same genuine curiosity. The practice was not organized around outcomes in the way that persuasion is. The practice was organized around the inquiry itself, and the inquiry for Socrates was its own adequate purpose. This is what distinguished his relationship to the question from the sophist relationship to argument. For the sophist, the argument was a means to an end, the end being conviction, influence, payment, the practical movement of a city's opinion in a desired direction. For Socrates, the question was not a means to anything beyond itself. The examined question was already valuable. The honest encounter with difficulty was already a kind of achievement, regardless of where it arrived. The aporia that resulted from genuine inquiry was not a way station on the road to knowledge. It was, in its own right, a form of philosophical honesty that most human conversations never reach. There is a word he used for the style of dialogue he was practicing, as opposed to the kind the sophists performed. He called it dialectic, from the Greek for conversation, for the back and forth of genuine exchange between two people following an argument together. The word is technical, but the thing it describes is not difficult to feel. It is what happens when two people are genuinely trying to find out what is true rather than trying to win, when the question matters more to both of them than the positions they arrived with, when the conversation is allowed to go somewhere neither of them anticipated, because that is where the argument honestly leads. Dialectic requires a particular willingness, the willingness to be wrong, and not merely in the small sense of having misstated a fact, but in the deeper sense of discovering that the ground you were standing on was not what you took it to be. This is harder than being persuaded by a good argument. Being persuaded by a good argument is something that can happen while you stand in place. What dialectics sometimes requires is the willingness to take a step back and discover that what felt like solid ground was something else. The general who has commanded armies does not usually arrive at conversations prepared to discover that his understanding of courage is incomplete. The encounter with Socrates at its best can make him willing to look. The elenchus, the name for the specific process of examination Socrates practiced, the step-by-step movement from confident assertion through careful questioning into contradiction and uncertainty, is not always comfortable for the people who experience it. Socrates knew this. He was aware that he had made enemies among the very people whose assumptions he had most thoroughly examined, and that the examination was the cause of the enmity, not despite being honest, but because it was. There is a particular resentment that some people feel when their confidence has been shown to rest on incomplete foundations, not gratitude for the clarity, but something closer to anger at the one who provided it. He had encountered this before. He continued the practice, because the alternative, as he understood it, was the compounding of ignorance under the shelter of assumed knowledge, the condition he had found everywhere in his investigation of Athens' wisest men, the politicians governing a democratic city who did not genuinely understand justice, the poets creating beautiful work whose principles they could not articulate, the craftsmen whose real competence had expanded, in their own estimation, into a general wisdom that the work of their hands had not actually produced. These were not malicious failures. They were the natural consequence of competence in one domain being extended, without examination, into claims about others. The practice Socrates offered was not a cure for this. Exactly. He did not arrive at the agora each morning with a program of philosophical improvement he intended to administer to the citizens of Athens. He arrived with the habit of honest attention and genuine questions, and he offered these things freely to whoever would engage. What the engagement produced in those for whom it produced anything at all was not knowledge in the sense of settled answers. It was a changed relationship to uncertainty, less fearful of it, more fluent in it, better at sitting with it without rushing toward the nearest available resolution. That changed relationship is what aporia, at its best, can leave behind. The man who has walked through it is not simply without an answer. He is acquainted with the shape of the question in a way that changes how it feels to hold it. He knows where the obvious paths go and why they do not continue. He knows the weight of the difficulty. He knows that the question is genuinely hard, not because he has not thought about it carefully enough, but because it is the kind of question that genuinely hard thinking produces, rather than resolves, and because there is a kind of honesty in acknowledging this that no confident answer, however fluent, can quite replicate. Outside the agora, somewhere in the mid-morning heat, a sophist is finishing a speech before a gathered audience, and the audience is moving with it, feeling the conviction that excellent rhetoric reliably produces. The speech is beautiful. The argument is clear. The conclusion is one the audience came prepared to accept, and the speaker has given them excellent reasons to accept it more firmly than they arrived willing to do. This is one thing that language can accomplish. It is a real thing. It has its uses. And in a quieter corner of the same open ground, a conversation is ending with no resolution. Two people have been sitting together in the mid-morning shade, following a question about what it means for an action to be just, and they have arrived at the recognition that the question has more territory in it than either of them previously understood. The conversation ends not with a conclusion, but with the honest acknowledgement that the question remains open and that both of them know more about why it is open than they did when they began. One of them rises and continues into the city. The other remains seated for a moment in the particular quiet that follows a genuine inquiry, not the quiet of completion, but the quiet of a question that has been honestly examined and found to be still alive, still patient, still waiting for anyone willing to sit with it and look. That quiet is not uncomfortable. It has the quality of a space from which something false has been gently removed, leaving the air a little clearer and the question visible in its full and honest shape. The question does not press. It does not demand. It rests in the space between one morning and the next, open as the agora itself is open, shared by everyone who passes through it, without belonging to any of them, available to whoever brings to it something more useful than certainty. The courtroom was full of morning light. 500 citizens had assembled in the open air, their voices low and overlapping before the proceedings began, the sound of the city continuing behind them, cartwheels on stone, the calls of vendors, the ordinary pulse of Athens carrying on without awareness of what was being decided in its midst. Socrates stood among them unhurried. He was 70 years old, and he had the bearing of a man who had spent 4 decades learning to pay careful attention and who found no reason to stop now. When he spoke, his voice did not rise to the occasion. It carried the same quality it always had in the agora, patient, plain, following the argument wherever it honestly led. The words he chose, in that crowded open space with his life before the jury, were not words he had prepared to impress. They were words he had always meant. The unexamined life, he said, is not worth living for a human being. It is easy to let a sentence like that pass without feeling its weight. 500 jurors heard it, and many of them heard it as provocation, as the kind of remark a man makes when he does not particularly care whether he survives the next hour. But it was not provocation. It was not a rhetorical weapon or a performance of indifference. It was, for Socrates, the most compressed and honest statement he could make of what he had spent his life believing. Not a claim he had arrived at recently, not something he would have softened in less dangerous circumstances. The same conviction had been guiding every conversation in every corner of Athens for 40 years. And here, in the most consequential hour of his life, it arrived exactly as it always had, plain, unhurried, and entirely serious. What does it mean to examine a life? The question requires slowing down before answering, because the first answers that arrive are usually the wrong ones. It is not the same as being intelligent. Many people who are quick and clever live without examining anything at all. It is not the same as reading philosophy or being able to produce arguments in a conversation. Socrates was clear about this. The examination he had in mind was not a performance of intellectual sophistication. It was something more like a practice, a daily discipline of honest attention turned not toward the world outside, but toward the assumptions, motivations, and values that shape the way one moves through it. A wealthy Athenian of Socrates' time would have had, by most measures, every reason to feel settled. Property and reputation and influence and family, these were the recognized goods of a recognized life. A man who had accumulated them could walk through the agora with a certain ease, knowing how things stood, and Socrates would approach such a man with no hostility and no contempt and no desire to humiliate. He would approach him with genuine curiosity. He would ask what all of it was for, not rhetorically, not to expose anything, just as a man who wanted to understand would ask, and somewhere in the conversation, very slowly and without drama, something would begin to shift. The man would find that when he reached for the reason behind the life he had been living, the reason was not where he expected it to be. The property was for security, the security was for happiness, and happiness was what, exactly? The question would open like a space that had always been there, but had never been entered. This is what the examined life begins with. Not crisis, not the collapse of everything believed, only the first honest admission that one has been moving in a direction without asking clearly where the direction leads. Socrates held that eudaimonia was the name for what every human being was in fact trying to achieve, not the word most people in Athens would have immediately reached for, but the reality behind what they were reaching for when they reached for anything at all. The word is often translated as happiness, and the translation is not wrong, exactly, but it loses something important in the passage. The happiness that eudaimonia describes is not a feeling. It is not the warm flush of pleasure, or the relief of a difficulty resolved, or the satisfaction of a desire met. These things come and go. They depend on conditions outside a person's control. A man can be pleased in the morning and miserable by afternoon without his fundamental condition having changed at all. What Socrates meant by eudaimonia was more like flourishing. The word carries within it a biological suggestion, a plant flourishing, a living thing functioning as it was made to function. A soul in the condition of eudaimonia is not a soul that has gotten everything it wanted. It is a soul that is functioning well, in the way that a soul, specifically a human soul, was made to function. And for Socrates, that meant something precise. It meant a soul that had cultivated virtue, that was engaged in philosophical reflection, that had not settled for the shallow satisfaction of externals, but had turned honestly inward and was doing the actual work of understanding how to live. This is the place where Socrates separated himself from almost everyone around him, not because he was rare in wanting a good life. Every person in Athens wanted a good life and spent considerable effort pursuing one. He separated himself by insisting that the people most visibly successful at acquiring the recognized goods of life were not thereby closer to eudaimonia, but often further from it. The politician with power and reputation, the merchant with wealth and ease, the general respected throughout the city. None of these people, in Socrates' view, had achieved the good life simply by acquiring what they had acquired. They had achieved the outward signs of the good life while leaving the inward condition that made a life genuinely good, almost entirely unattended: wealth, political power, social honor. Socrates placed these in the category of things that could be used well or badly, depending on the condition of the soul that held them. In the hands of a person who had cultivated wisdom and virtue, wealth might be genuinely useful. In the hands of a person who had not, it would simply amplify whatever confusion already existed in the soul it served. Power given to a person without virtue would not make the person more virtuous. It would make the exercise of that unexamined power larger and more consequential. The external goods, considered on their own, were genuinely neutral. The only thing that determined whether a human life went well or badly, in the sense that truly mattered, was the condition of the soul doing the living. And the soul's condition, for Socrates, was not something that could be improved by acquisition. It could only be improved by the one specific practice he spent his life conducting and inviting others into, the practice of honest examination. There is something in this that asks to be held carefully before moving past it, because it is easy to hear the claim that external goods do not produce the good life, and receive it as a familiar piece of wisdom, the kind of thing everyone more or less agrees with before going back to pursuing the external goods anyway. But Socrates was not offering a polite observation that money can't buy happiness. He was making a claim that ran considerably deeper than that. He was saying that the pursuit of external goods, in the absence of philosophical self-examination, was not merely an incomplete version of the good life. It was a misdirection so fundamental that it placed the pursuit in exactly the wrong territory, turning away from the only thing that could actually deliver what the pursuer was after. A man who believed his life was going well because his affairs were in order had mistaken the map for the territory. He had looked at the external shape of a flourishing life, the markers, the indicators, the signs that people around him recognized as success, and had concluded that the shape was the substance. Socrates did not think this was dishonest. He thought it was a failure of understanding. And this is where his account of the good life connects to something unusual in his ethics. Socrates held that virtue is a form of knowledge, not a performance, not a habit of right behavior drilled in from the outside, but a genuine understanding of what is good. The claim sounds strange at first. It is more natural to think of virtue as something more like willpower, the strength to do the right thing, even when doing the wrong thing would be easier or more pleasant. The weak-willed person, on this ordinary view, knows perfectly well what the right thing is, and simply lacks the strength to do it. Moral failure is a failure of effort or character. It is something a person is responsible for in the way an athlete is responsible for not training hard enough. Socrates looked at this ordinary view and found something he could not accept in it. He had looked at the people around him, at the enormous variety of ways in which human beings failed to act well, and what he saw did not look like weakness. It looked like confusion. The person who chose badly was not, in Socrates' reading, a person who saw clearly what the right thing was and overrode that clear vision with appetite or desire. The person who chose badly was a person who had not seen clearly in the first place, who had reached for what appeared to be good without having done the genuine work of understanding what good actually meant. The appearance of good, The pleasure, the advantage, the recognition had been mistaken for the thing itself, and the mistake was not a failure of will, but a failure of sight. If this is right, then every moral failure is at its root an intellectual failure, not a lapse of resolve, but a gap in understanding, not weakness, but a form of blindness that more careful thought might have corrected. There is a gentleness in this that goes against the grain of how most people think about wrongdoing. The more natural response to a person who has acted badly is judgment, the sense that they knew better and chose not to act on what they knew, which makes them responsible in a way that calls for reproach. Socrates' position does not exactly remove responsibility, but it changes its character. The wrongdoer, on his account, did not see clearly, did not understand, in the deep sense of genuine understanding, what they were choosing, and the appropriate response to a person who has not seen clearly is not condemnation, but something more like the careful attention of someone who is trying to help them see. This is, in the end, what Socrates was doing in every conversation, not winning arguments, not demonstrating the failures of the people he spoke with. He was attending to them, following the shape of their thinking with genuine care, helping them notice where the thinking had taken a wrong turn or had stopped before it needed to. The analogy to his mother's work was one he returned to. The midwife who does not deliver the child herself, but is present, patient, and skilled for what the laboring person is bringing forth. Socrates did not consider himself to have knowledge that he was depositing into others. He considered himself to be someone who could help others find what was already in them, latent and waiting, needing only to be drawn carefully out. And the drawing out, the patient, careful questioning, was not an occasional activity for him. It was the daily texture of his life. Socrates did not retire to a private space to conduct philosophy. He did not have a school in the formal sense, a building with students enrolled and a curriculum administered. He was in the streets, in the gymnasia, at the market stalls, at the dinner parties of the wealthy and the informal gatherings of the young. Wherever conversation was happening, Socrates was turning it, gently and persistently, toward the question that interested him most. How are we living, and is it enough? The question took different forms in different conversations, but beneath the variations the same inquiry was always present, the same refusal to let the conversation settle into the comfortable performance of knowledge that had not been genuinely earned. A young man, perhaps training in the gymnasium after exercise, seated in the easy warmth of late morning with his companions, might find the conversation beginning with an entirely ordinary topic, athletics, perhaps, or the qualities of a good general, or what a friend is, and would find, before he quite noticed it happening, that Socrates had followed the thread of what the young man said until the thread led somewhere neither of them had expected to be. Not somewhere alarming, not a trap, but somewhere honest, somewhere that had the quality of a space suddenly opened up in what had seemed solid ground. Somewhere the young man would find himself looking at a question he had never actually considered before, even though the question was one his entire life had been implicitly answering without examination. This is the gift of the examined life that Socrates was describing and enacting simultaneously, not the arrival at a final answer, not the satisfaction of having resolved the question of how to live. Something more specific than that, and in some ways more quietly valuable. The examined life offers the condition of knowing what you are actually doing, of having looked at the assumptions behind the choices and not simply inherited them, of having asked, at least once and ideally many times, and in many forms, what you take the good to consist in, and whether your daily life is actually moving in that direction. The alternative, And this is the thing Socrates found genuinely difficult to accept, is a life that is answering the question of how to live by default. A life shaped by social expectations, by accumulated habit, by the unexamined assumption that the recognized goods are worth pursuing because everyone around you recognizes them. Not a wicked life necessarily, not a cruel one, simply an unlived one in the specific sense that no one has truly been present for it, in the way that genuine presence requires honesty with oneself about what one is doing and why. The wealthy man who sits with Socrates and discovers slowly that he has never seriously asked himself what any of it is for. This man is not being told that his life was wrong. He is not being condemned or diminished. Something subtler than that is happening. He is being given the first honest look at the shape of his own existence, perhaps for the first time, and the look, which might feel at first like a kind of vertigo, is also the beginning of something. Because once the question is genuinely open, once the assumption has been honestly examined rather than silently inherited, there is a possibility that did not exist before, not the certainty of an answer, but the possibility of actually living the question rather than living past it every day without noticing. Socrates in the gymnasium on an ordinary morning, seated among young men in easy conversation. The image is a domesticated one. Nothing dramatic is happening. The light is pleasant. The questions begin somewhere comfortable and wander, as good conversations do, toward the places that turn out to matter. And Socrates does not impose direction on this. He follows. He asks, "Splay." He holds the thread of the inquiry with a steadiness that comes not from knowing where it leads, but from trusting that honest following is worthwhile in itself, that the quality of the attention matters more than the arrival at a destination. Because for Socrates, the examined life was not a means to an end. It was not a process one endured in order to arrive at a set of correct beliefs that could then be held in place forever. It was the thing itself. The quality of sustained, honest attention turned toward one's assumptions, turned toward one's values, turned toward the gap between how one believes one is living and how one is actually living. This was not a preparation for eudaimonia. It was, in his view, the closest thing to eudaimonia that a human being could experience in the ordinary conditions of an ordinary day. There is something in this that wants to settle rather than startle. The examined life, as Socrates conceived it, does not require unusual circumstances. It does not require the leisure of the wealthy or the particular gifts of the exceptional. A conversation with a cobbler about what courage is, conducted in good faith and followed honestly, belongs to the examined life as fully as any exchange between Socrates and the most distinguished general in Athens. The practice is available anywhere, in the market, in the home, in the simple act of sitting with one's own experience at the end of the day and asking, without judgment and without urgency, whether the day has been lived in the direction of what one actually values. Socrates did not claim that everyone who examined their life would reach the same conclusions. He did not offer the examined life as a path to a predetermined destination. What he offered was more like a quality of engagement, the quality of actually being present for one's own existence, rather than moving through it on inherited assumptions, of being, in some meaningful sense, the author of the choices one makes, rather than simply the heir of choices one never made. A person recognizes in some quiet moment that a choice they had attributed to weakness, a moral failure they had reproached themselves for without quite understanding it, was in fact a failure of understanding. They had not seen clearly what they were choosing, the pleasure or the advantage, or the ease had presented itself as good, and they had reached for it as one reaches for something genuinely good, not having done the prior work of understanding that the appearance and the substance were not the same. The recognition, when it comes, does not look like guilt. It looks more like clarity. The path forward is not self-reproach, but renewed attention. Well, not punishment, but the patient return to the question, what is the good I am actually after, and does this way of living move toward it or away from it? This is the specific texture of what Socrates offered. Not a cure for moral failure, not a method that would prevent wrong choices in the future, only the ongoing practice of honest attention, which slowly, over time, shifts the quality of the life it touches, not by filling the soul with correct answers, by keeping the soul awake to the question. Eudaimonia, as Socrates understood it, is not something one arrives at and then possesses. It is not a destination that once reached remains secure. It is a condition, something like the condition of a person who is genuinely practicing a difficult art, who is present to what they are doing, who is neither complacent nor despairing, but simply engaged, in a way that is its own form of steadiness. A human being, functioning as a human being, as a creature capable of reason and reflection and genuine inquiry, is a human being in the condition that is, for that creature, the condition of living well. Everything else, the wealth, the honor, the ease, may or may not be present. It does not finally determine the condition of the soul. The soul determines itself through the quality of attention it brings to the practice of understanding what it is and what it is for. It took Socrates his whole life to say this clearly, or rather, it took his whole life to live it clearly, which is different and in some ways harder, because the claim is easy enough to state. The difficulty is in the daily enactment of it, in the returning, each morning, in each conversation, and each ordinary encounter, to the same patient willingness to follow the question wherever it honestly leads, in the refusal to settle into comfortable positions, in the ongoing resistance to the very human temptation to stop asking once the asking becomes inconvenient. There were people in Athens who found this tiresome, who found Socrates not illuminating, but irritating, a man who asked questions that did not need asking, who made conversations uncomfortable that had been perfectly comfortable before, who seemed incapable of simply accepting the way things were and moving on. These people were not stupid. They understood exactly what he was doing. They objected to it, because the examined life, however gently it is conducted, is not always welcome. The willingness to ask whether what one values is actually worth valuing is for someone who has built a life on the assumption that it is, not merely an intellectual exercise. It is a pressure on the foundations. Socrates did not press with cruelty. He pressed with curiosity. But the pressure was real, and the people who felt it most were often the ones who had invested most heavily in the unexamined positions he was gently questioning. The politician who had built a career on the claim to know what justice required. The craftsman who had extended his expertise in making things to a belief that he also understood the good. The poet who had concluded from the beauty of what he had made that he understood beauty itself. Socrates had spoken with all of them. He had come away from each conversation more certain that the genuine work of understanding remained undone, and that the appearance of knowledge was, in each case, more firmly in possession of the man than any actual knowledge was. The appearance of knowledge, this was what he had found, again and again, not ignorance combined with humility, ignorance combined with the confident sense of knowing, and of these two conditions, the second was, in Socrates' view, considerably more dangerous. The person who does not know and knows they do not know is in a position to begin. The person who does not know but believes they know has nowhere to start from because they believe they have already arrived. His own advantage, such as it was not that he knew more. He was clear about this. In the positive sense, in the sense of having answers to the questions he spent his life asking, Socrates claimed nothing for himself. What he claimed was narrower, and he held more honest. He did not know what justice was, or what courage was, or what virtue was in its fullest sense, and he knew that he did not know. This was the slight and strange and not entirely comfortable advantage he had over the people he spoke with. Not knowledge, only the honest acknowledgment of its absence. But this acknowledgment, held steadily and without distress, turned out to be the condition from which genuine inquiries could begin, because once the false wall of assumed knowledge comes down, the question is actually open. The space in which real thinking can happen is genuinely available. The person standing in that space may feel, at first, something like unsteadiness. The certainty they had been carrying was, it turns out, doing a great deal of structural work. Without it, everything seems less fixed. But Socrates had found, and was trying through his conversations to help others find, that the unsteadiness was temporary and the openness was real, that standing before a genuine question without the false security of a premature answer was not a worse position to be in, it was a better one. The good life for Socrates was lived in that openness, not in the resolution of the question, but in the honest daily engagement with it, in the willingness to keep asking, keep attending, keep returning to the examination with the same patient curiosity that had brought the examination to where it stood. He would walk home through the evening streets of Athens, having spent the whole day in conversation, having been at the gymnasium in the morning, the market at midday, a dinner gathering in the early evening, and there was no dramatic change in him for all of it. No sense of having accumulated a body of conclusions that would be deposited somewhere and drawn on later. Just the practiced habit of honest attention, carried through the day as naturally as one carries the day's ordinary necessities. The same willingness to follow the question, the same refusal to pretend to know what had not been earned. The same patient expectation that the asking itself was worth doing, not because it would eventually produce the right answer, but because asking honestly was what living honestly required. There is something in this that the evening light of Athens seems made for, the city quieting toward the end of the day, the long shadows of the Acropolis falling across the streets below, the conversations of the market finished, and the questions they had raised still drifting, unresolved, somewhere in the air. Socrates neither more nor less than he was that morning, possessed of nothing except what he had always possessed, the willingness to attend, the refusal to settle, the steady practice of a life that took its own existence seriously enough to keep examining it. The question he asked was not complicated to state. How should one live? What is actually worth pursuing? What is the good? And does the way one is spending one's days actually move toward it? Every person in Athens was, in some sense, already answering these questions by the way they lived. The examined life was simply the choice to answer them openly, honestly, with the lights on, to be present to the answering rather than letting it happen in the background of an existence spent looking elsewhere. And the remarkable thing, the thing that carries across the centuries from Socrates' conversations to wherever a person might be now, is that the examination requires nothing special, no particular training, no unusual gift, no withdrawal from the ordinary conditions of an ordinary life. It requires only the willingness in the midst of any moment, to pause long enough to ask what is actually happening here, and why one is doing what one is doing, and whether it is the direction one honestly wants to be going in. The examined life is not something to be achieved in a single insight and then held. It is something practiced in the smallest ordinary transactions of the day, over and over, with patience rather than urgency, with curiosity rather than judgment. Socrates believed that every human being already had within them the capacity for this kind of attention, not as an unusual endowment, but as something latent in every person who had ever noticed the distance between what they said they valued and how they actually lived. Every person who had ever felt, in some quiet moment, that the life they were living was somehow not quite the life they meant to be living. Every such person had already begun the examined life without knowing its name. The examination was not a foreign practice to be imported into the life from the outside. It was the honest acknowledgement of something already present, already trying to be heard. The lamp that Socrates carried through the streets of Athens was not a lamp of answers. It was a lamp of honest attention. It shed light not on destinations, but on the ground immediately beneath one's feet, on the question one was standing in, on the assumption one had inherited without examining, on the gap between the life one was living and the life one meant to live. The light was small and steady and did not illuminate everything at once, but in its small steady circle, the ground was clearly visible, and on clearly visible ground, a person could begin to walk with something like genuine intention. This is what the examined life offers in the end. Not the comfort of settled answers, not the relief of a question finally closed, only the quality of actually inhabiting one's own existence, of being present to the choices one makes and the values one acts from and the direction one is moving, of being, in every ordinary moment, the kind of being that a human being most fully is, attentive, questioning, honest, alive to the difficulty, and unwilling to pretend it away. The question of how to live has never required extraordinary conditions. It has always been available in whatever room one is in, whatever conversation one is having, whatever moment one is standing in, at the end of a long and ordinary day. Socrates knew this, and spent his life demonstrating it, and the demonstration continues in every instance of honest attention paid to the shape of one's own existence, quiet, unhurried, asking nothing but what the moment honestly holds. The portico of the King Archon's court stood at the edge of the agora, and in the ordinary foot traffic of a morning in Athens, it was easy to miss. Merchants moved past it. A man carrying a bundle of hides crossed in front of its low steps without looking up. The city had its rhythms, its commerce, its usual noise, and the portico belonged to that noise, as much as to anything solemn. It was there, on a morning like many others, that Socrates arrived for his preliminary hearing, the formality that preceded a formal trial, and found standing at the entrance with the quiet self-possession of a man who has recently done something he considers correct, the figure of Euthyphro. Euthyphro was a religious expert. He knew the laws of piety, the way a craftsman knows the properties of his material, with confidence, with a sense of long familiarity, with the particular ease that comes from never having been seriously questioned. He was on his way into the same court to prosecute his own father on a charge of impiety, a thing most Athenians would have found troubling, a complication of filial duty and religious obligation that most men would have stepped carefully around. Euthyphro did not step around it. He moved through it with the clean certainty of someone who knows exactly what the gods require, and who has decided that his father has failed to provide it. Socrates listened to this. He asked, in the way he always asked, a question that sounded almost admiring. If Euthyphro knew what piety was, genuinely knew, with the precision required to prosecute a father on its behalf, then perhaps Euthyphro could teach him. His own trial was coming. He had been charged with impiety himself. He would benefit, he said, from understanding the concept properly. Euthyphro agreed. He had, in his certainty, no reason not to. What followed moved slowly at first, the way all of these conversations moved, with the surface ease of two men standing in morning light, talking about something they both seemed to understand. Piety is what the gods love, Euthyphro said. Socrates considered this. The gods, it was well known, disagreed with one another. They disputed, they quarreled, they divided over the same actions as over everything else. Did this mean that the same act was both pious and impious, depending on which god one consulted? Euthyphro adjusted his definition. Piety is what all the gods love, he said, unanimously, without exception. Socrates nodded. Then he asked the question that has not stopped being asked since the morning it was first spoken on those steps. Is something pious because the gods love it, or do the gods love it because it is pious? The question arrived without drama. It was not delivered as a weapon, but Euthyphro, standing in the early light outside the court where Socrates would one day be condemned, found that he could not answer it. If things are pious simply because the gods love them, then piety is nothing more than divine preference, a matter of will, not of anything inherent in the act itself. But if the gods love things because those things are pious, then the piety exists independently of divine love, which means the gods are responding to something they did not create, something that stands beyond them. Either answer opened a difficulty that Euthyphro had not anticipated. His certainty, which had been so clean and so portable only minutes before, had developed an edge he could not smooth away. The dialogue does not end in resolution. It does not conclude with Euthyphro reformed, or with a definition agreed upon, or with the nature of piety settled between the two of them. It ends with Euthyphro remembering an appointment, excusing himself, and walking away into the city. The question he could not answer walked with him. It has been walking ever since, through the long centuries of religious philosophy, through every argument about whether goodness depends on divine command, or whether it stands independent of any authority that might issue such commands. The question did not ask Euthyphro to abandon his faith. It asked him to understand what he meant by it, which is a different thing entirely and considerably harder. Socrates watched him go, presumably, and then went inside for his own proceedings. He carried the same patience into that space that he carried into every conversation, the patience of a man who has learned that understanding does not come quickly, and that the questions worth asking tend to outlast any particular morning. There is another kind of patience in the dialogues, one that belongs not to any specific encounter, but to a single recurring image. It is the image of a boy learning something he did not know he knew. In the dialogue, the Meno, Socrates sits with an uneducated slave boy and leads him through a geometric problem, the construction of a square, whose area is double that of a given square. He does not explain the proof. He does not write the steps on a tablet and hand it over. He asks questions carefully, one following another, and the boy responds, and the responses are wrong at first, and then slightly less wrong, and then through a long patient process of guided inquiry, the boy arrives at the correct answer. The ground between them might have been traced with a stick, the figures drawn in dust or sand, the demonstration visible in the dirt underfoot. What is visible in the dialogue itself is something quieter than a proof. It is the boy discovering that a capacity for reason was already in him before Socrates arrived, waiting only for the right questions to call it forward. He did not receive the answer from outside himself. He found it within the working of his own mind, guided but not directed, assisted but not instructed. Socrates describes this process in the same dialogue through an idea that reaches further than geometry. He calls it recollection, the suggestion that the soul has known all things in previous existences, that learning is not the acquisition of new information, but the recovery of knowledge already possessed, lying dormant in the soul, the way a seed lies dormant in cold ground. The idea is strange, and Socrates does not defend it as a certainty. He holds it more carefully than that, as the best available account of how someone who has never been taught can nonetheless reason correctly when properly questioned. The metaphysics may or may not be exactly right. What the image points toward is something harder to dismiss, that the capacity for rational thought is not given by teachers or accumulated through experience alone, but is somehow native to the person doing the thinking, prior to instruction, waiting to be called. The boy traces another figure in the dust. He works slowly, he gets one step wrong, and Socrates, without correcting him, simply asks what follows, and the boy, following his own error to its consequence, sees where it breaks down. He backs up. He tries again. By the end, he has a proof. He did not have it an hour ago, and yet something in him was already oriented toward it, already capable of recognizing it when it arrived. The question the dialogue leaves hanging, unresolved, as these dialogues tend to leave their deepest questions, is what this capacity is, and where it lives, and what it means that every person carries it, regardless of education, regardless of station, regardless of the world they happen to have been born into. The honest answer is that no one fully knows, but the demonstration is there, drawn in the dust, and what it suggests about the nature of knowledge and the nature of the mind has not been exhausted by any argument that came after it. There is a room underground, or something like a room, a cave, a chamber, a long hollow in the earth, where the light does not reach. In it are people who have been there since birth, chained in such a way that they cannot turn their heads, cannot see the entrance behind them, cannot see anything except the wall directly before them. On that wall, shadows move. The shadows are cast by objects passing before a fire behind the prisoners, objects carried by people they cannot see, the fire itself hidden from their sight. The shadows are all the prisoners have ever known. They have named the shadows. They have learned to predict which shadows follow which. In the world, as they understand it, the shadows are not shadows at all. They are simply the things that exist. Plato sets this image in the mouth of Socrates in a dialogue about justice and the ideal city, and for a moment it is easy to take it only as an analogy for political life, the cave as a figure for citizens who accept received opinion without examination. But the image carries more than politics. What the cave describes is the condition of anyone who has not yet turned toward the light, anyone whose understanding of the world is built entirely from what is nearest and most familiar, who takes the surface of things for the whole of things, who has learned the names of the shadows without asking what casts them. One prisoner is freed. The dialogue says nothing about how or by whom, only that it happens, that the chains are loosed, and the person is compelled to turn. The turning is painful. The fire is brighter than the shadows. The shapes of things in the firelight are less clear, at first, than the shadows on the wall, which were at least familiar. The freed prisoner is not grateful. Initially, the adjustment hurts. The new information conflicts with everything learned in the old position. Turned further toward the entrance, the prisoner begins to ascend toward the surface, toward actual daylight, and the pain intensifies before it eases. The sun itself, seen for the first time, cannot be looked at directly. Everything is too bright, too vast, too different from the world below. Then, slowly, the eyes adjust. First, the prisoner sees reflections in water, in surfaces that mediate the light. Then, the things themselves, illuminated. Then, the night sky. Then, finally, the sun, the source of all the light that makes the seeing possible, the thing by which everything else is known. Plato does not let the image rest there in the moment of philosophical triumph. The freed prisoner who has seen the sun is asked to return to the cave, to descend back into the dark and join those who are still chained. Those prisoners will not believe what the returning philosopher tries to tell them. Their eyes, adjusted to the dark, will see only that the philosopher's eyes are now worse at reading the shadows, slower, less reliable. In the world the cave provides, the one who has been to the surface is impaired, not improved. The dialogue is honest about what follows from this. It does not pretend the return is welcome. What the allegory of the cave charts is not only the structure of philosophical awakening, but its social cost, the difficulty of returning to ordinary life with knowledge that ordinary life does not know how to accommodate. The philosopher who has seen the sun is not simply enlightened. They are also disoriented, and then reorienting, and then returning to a world that may prefer the shadows. This is the arc Plato gives to intellectual transformation, not a clean ascent to light, but a movement through discomfort, adjustment, loss, and the harder discipline of coming back down with what was found above. The image has stayed in the philosophical conversation for a long time now, not because it settles anything about the nature of reality, but because it captures something true about what it feels like to have an assumption dissolved, the discomfort of adjustment, the period in which the new understanding is less comfortable than the old error, the slow calibration of a mind learning to see in a different light. Socrates in the dialogue sits with friends in the cool air of a summer afternoon, and the cave is one of several images he offers. He holds none of them as final proofs. He holds them as the best available shapes for something difficult to think about directly. The difference between appearance and reality, between the world as ordinarily encountered and the world as it might be known by a mind that has done the work of examining its own assumptions. The cave is not a doctrine, it is a gesture toward a distinction that every serious examination of experience eventually arrives at, that what seems to be the case and what is the case are not always the same thing, and that the gap between them is where philosophy lives. The symposium is a dinner party. That fact deserves a moment of attention because it is easy to read past it, to treat the setting as incidental, a mere frame for the arguments inside. But the symposium is a philosophical dialogue about love, and it takes place at a celebration, with wine and reclining guests, and the ordinary pleasure of good company. And this is not incidental at all. Plato set the conversation there because love in the ordinary sense begins exactly there, in a room with other people, with food and drink, with the ordinary textures of human desire. What the dialogue does is follow that ordinary beginning to somewhere much less ordinary. The guests speak in turn. Phaedrus, Pausanias, Aristophanes, Agathon, each offers an account of love, each more elaborate than the last, the praise building and accumulating until Socrates takes his turn. And Socrates, as he almost always does, steps aside from the expected form. He does not deliver a speech, he reports a conversation, a teaching he received from a woman named Diotima, a priestess from Mantinea, who told him what love actually is. Diotima's account of love begins with an ordinary observation, made strange by following it carefully. A young person is attracted to a beautiful body. That is where the account begins, not with anything elevated, not with anything that requires philosophical preparation, but with the most common form of human desire. From there, Diotima leads the inquiry upward, step by step, each step a generalization of the one before. A person who understands why one beautiful body attracts them will come to see that the beauty in that body is the same beauty present in all beautiful bodies, and the love of one will open into a love of beauty in bodies generally. From there, the inquiry moves to beautiful souls, the recognition that the loveliness of a person's character is a more permanent and less fragile form of beauty than the beauty of their face. Then further, to the beauty of ideas, of knowledge, of the structures by which things are understood. At each step, the lover is not abandoning what they loved before, but finding it in a larger form, seeing that what they were drawn to was always beauty itself, appearing in the particular container that happened to be nearest. The ascent ends in Diotima's account with something that has no container at all. Absolute beauty, not beautiful in one respect and not in another, not beautiful here and not there, not beautiful now and not later, but simply and entirely beautiful, without qualification, without context, without the limitation of appearing in any one thing rather than another. The person who has made the full ascent, who has loved and followed beauty, honestly all the way from the particular face to the absolute form, has arrived at something that cannot be adequately described, only approached. Diotima says that if anything in a human life is worth living for, it is this vision. The image of the latter rises through a dinner party conversation in an Athenian house, and it changes the nature of the ordinary occasion without denying it. The wine on the table is still wine. The guests are still reclining in the ordinary way guests recline, but the desire that runs through the evening, the desire for beauty, for company, for the pleasure of good minds together, has been given a shape that extends beyond the room, beyond the city, beyond the range of any particular evening or any particular life. Diotima does not suggest that ordinary human love is a mistake, or that the beautiful face of a friend is something to be dismissed as a mere shadow of something higher. She suggests that it is the beginning, the first honest step in a movement that can carry a person as far as they are willing to go. The philosophical examination of love, in this account, is itself a form of love. The inquiry does not replace the desire, it follows it, and in following it honestly, discovers what the desire was always aimed at, beneath its most immediate appearances. Whether the absolute beauty Diotima describes actually exists, whether the final rung of the ladder arrives at something real or at a beautiful philosophical fiction, is a question the dialogue leaves open. Plato does not prove it. Socrates, reporting the teaching, does not claim certainty. What the ascent offers is not metaphysical proof, but something closer to a description of what it is like to love something seriously enough, to follow the love wherever it honestly leads. Most people stop somewhere on the ladder. The dialogue does not condemn this. It only draws the ladder to its full height and leaves it standing. In the last month of Socrates' life, his friends gathered around him daily in a prison cell in Athens, and the conversations continued. They were different from the conversations in the agora, more intimate, more patient, with a quality of gathered attention that came from everyone in the room, knowing the hours were numbered. The cell was small. Light came through a high window. The friends arrived in the morning and stayed until the jailers sent them away at dusk, and Socrates sat with them and spoke the way he had always spoken, with the careful, unhurried attention to argument that had characterized every exchange of his philosophical life. The dialogue known as the Feteto is set on the last of these days. Phaedo, who was present, later told the story to a man named Echecrates, and the dialogue moves through both frames, the outer conversation and the inner one, the account of the day as it happened, and the arguments Socrates made as the light outside changed and the hours moved. What the dialogue records is not a farewell in the ordinary sense. It is a philosophical investigation into the nature of the soul and the question of whether death is something the philosopher should fear. Socrates' argument begins from the observation that the philosophical life, taken seriously, involves a persistent effort to loosen the soul from its dependence on the body. The body, in this account, is a source of distraction, of pleasure and pain and appetite, and the constantly shifting demands of physical existence. The philosopher who tries to think clearly about the nature of justice, or beauty, or goodness itself, is trying to attend to something that the body constantly interrupts. Sight and hearing and touch all report the particular, the changing, the impermanent, this beautiful thing, this just action, this good moment. The philosopher wants to attend to beauty itself, justice itself, goodness itself, the stable forms behind the shifting appearances, and the body, with its steady catalogue of needs and distractions, makes this difficult. Death in this frame does the permanently what the philosopher has been trying to do, temporarily all along. It separates the soul from the body. If the soul genuinely has access to more stable truths when it is less entangled with the body's demands, then death, as Socrates argues it, is not the interruption of philosophical life, but its completion. The philosopher who has spent a lifetime learning to attend beyond the body's noise has been, in a sense, practicing for this. The practice has been a rehearsal. The death is the performance, and the philosopher should no more fear it than a musician fears the concert they have spent years preparing for. The argument is careful, and it has limits, and the dialogue does not hide them. Socrates' friends raise objections. Simmias suggests that the soul might be simply a harmony of physical elements, the way a musical tuning is a harmony of physical tensions in a stringed instrument. And if the instrument is destroyed, the harmony necessarily ceases. Pebes raises a different concern. Even if the soul is not reducible to the body, it might simply exhaust itself through successive lifetimes, wearing through like a coat worn long enough. Socrates takes both objections seriously. He does not dismiss them. He works through them, addressing each with what he regards as the best available response, and there is a quality in his engagement with these challenges that is itself the philosophical point, the willingness to follow the argument where it leads, to take the counter-argument seriously, to hold the question open even on the last day. The arguments for the soul's immortality that the dialogue offers are not proofs in the geometric sense. They are the best available case for a position that cannot be demonstrated with certainty, and Socrates does not claim more than this. He is not serene because he knows what comes after death. He is serene because he has examined the question with the same honest attention he gave to every question, and he has found that the arguments for fear do not outweigh the arguments for equanimity. He may be wrong. He says as much. But the examined position, uncertainty held after careful inquiry, is different from the unexamined fear that most people carry into the thought of their own death. A fear made of assumptions, never inspected, never tested, never honestly followed to their conclusions. The friends weep. This is in the dialogue, plainly and without flinching. The friends weep, and Socrates, seeing them, says that this is why he sent the women away earlier, because tears are not what the occasion calls for. Not because grief is ignoble, but because the occasion is philosophical, and philosophy deserves the same clear attention here that it deserved in the agora, in the gymnasium, in the houses where dinner parties became meditations on love and beauty and the nature of goodness. What persists across all the conversations and the dialogues, the portico outside the court, the geometric proof traced in dust, the cave allegory told in summer air, the ladder of love ascending through a dinner party. The prison cell with its small high window is the same quality of attention, not certainty, not a settled system, not a body of conclusions delivered from authority and accepted without examination. Only the consistent, practiced, patient willingness to follow a question wherever it honestly leads, and to hold what is found there without either grasping it too tightly or letting it dissolve into comfortable vagueness. The dialogues do not agree with each other about everything. The soul described in the Phaedo and the love described in the Symposium belong to the same broad philosophical vision, but the particular arguments go in different directions, and the tensions between them are not always resolved. Plato wrote across a long life, and his thinking moved and developed, and what the dialogues contain is not a system, but a practice, a recurring demonstration of what it looks like to think carefully about the hardest questions in conversation with honesty without the comfort of easy resolution. Socrates, at the center of all of them, carries this quality the way his body carried his worn cloak, lightly, without making much of it, as a simple feature of who he was and how he moved through the world. The general who thought he understood courage left a conversation with Socrates less certain than he arrived. The priest who thought he understood piety found his certainty gently dissolved on a morning when he had other things to attend to. The slave boy who could not have stated a geometric proof sat with a figure in the dust and found the reasoning already present in him, waiting. The conversations themselves, the specific arguments, the particular moments of aporia, the slow movement from confident assertion to honest uncertainty, are not separate from the philosophical conclusions they arrive at. They are the conclusions. The form and the content hold each other. To read a Platonic dialogue is to witness, in the structure of the exchange itself, the practice it recommends. The reader becomes, for the duration of reading, someone in conversation with Socrates, not instructed, but questioned, and by the questioning, slowly changed. In the prison cell on the last day, the arguments move through their stages as the light outside the window changes. Morning becomes afternoon. Afternoon holds its particular quality of Athenian light, clear and warm, and somehow already carrying the suggestion of evening. Socrates' voice does not change with the light. It has the same careful quality it had at the beginning of the conversation, the same willingness to consider a counter-argument, to slow down at a difficulty, to trace the question one more step before settling into whatever provisional answer is available. The friends are still weeping. The arguments are still moving. The light outside is still changing, and the thought that has run through all the conversations, that the examined life is not simply a philosophical preference, but the proper activity of a human soul, the thing the soul is most fitted for, the practice without which everything else is restlessness. That thought is still present in the room, as present as the light, as steady as the voice that carries it. Philosophical attentiveness is not a technique. It is not a method that can be picked up in the morning and put down in the evening, a tool that belongs to certain occasions and not others. What the dialogues show, from the portico where Euthyphro struggled with a question he could not answer to the cell where Socrates argued with his friends on the last afternoon, is that attentiveness of this kind becomes the texture of a life, the way the light became the texture of that last day, present in the room without announcing itself, falling on every conversation and every argument and every honest moment of not knowing with the same calm, steady illumination. The voice in the cell was still and engaged. Outside the window, the city was doing what cities do. The agora with its merchants and its ordinary transactions, the streets with their ordinary foot traffic, the sky above the Acropolis with its particular quality of late afternoon that has not changed across all the centuries since. Inside the cell, the thought was still moving. The argument had not arrived at its final resting place. Perhaps it never does. Perhaps the movement itself, the careful, patient, honest following of a question, is not a path to an answer so much as a condition, a way of being present to one's own existence that does not require a destination to justify itself. The light outside the window continued to change, and the voice inside the room continued to follow the thought, and the conversation that had begun so many years earlier in the ordinary morning of the Agora, among merchants and craftsmen and politicians who believed themselves to know what justice was, had arrived at this still and luminous place, not resolved, not completed, but held, with great care, in the full attention of a mind that had spent a lifetime learning to stay with what was difficult without flinching, and to find, at the depth of the difficulty, something that was not panic, but patience, not confusion, but the particular clarity that comes from having looked at a thing for a very long time without looking away. The morning that Socrates walked to the court was an ordinary morning in Athens. The vendors were already at their stalls. Bread was set out, and dried fish, and the small clay lamps that the potters had brought in from the kilns at the edge of the city. A donkey moved through the narrow street near the Agora with its familiar patient slowness, and the men who stepped aside to let it pass went on with their conversations, their arguments, their plans for the afternoon. The air carried the smell of charcoal and of the sea. The light on the stone was the light of early morning in Attica, pale gold, specific, the kind of light that makes everything it touches look both familiar and briefly strange. Socrates had walked these streets for 70 years. He knew their textures. He knew which stones shifted underfoot near the corner where the shoemakers worked, and where the mud collected after rain, and where the young men gathered on warm evenings to argue about nothing in particular until the arguing became something. He had stopped in 100 of these doorways to ask a passing acquaintance what courage was, or whether beauty and goodness were the same thing, or whether a man who knew what justice required could ever choose otherwise. The street had been his school. The morning light had been his lamp. None of this was over yet, not while he was still walking through it. The court was in the open air. This was the way of Athens, public life arranged so that a citizen could see, from almost any angle, what the city was doing in its own name. The space would fill with 500 jurors, each one a citizen, each one carrying his vote. 500 men who had lived their own ordinary lives, who had families and trades and opinions about the war, and about the crops, and about whether the festivals had been properly conducted. 500 men who believed, in the main, that they knew what they knew. Socrates had spent 40 years asking that belief, very gently, to show what it was made of. He arrived at the court as a man arrives at a place he has thought about carefully and made his peace with. There was no hurry in his walk. The people who knew him, and most people in this part of the city, knew him, or knew his silhouette. The stocky figure, moving barefoot through the dust, would have seen nothing unusual in his pace. He did not carry the look of a man bracing. He carried the look of a man who had sat with a question for long enough that the sitting itself had become the answer. The charges were 3 in number: that he had failed to honor the gods the city honored, that he had introduced divine beings of his own devising, that he had corrupted the youth of Athens. These were not trivial accusations in a city that had just survived the worst war in its history, that had watched its democracy stripped away by oligarchs, that had spent years rebuilding something it had always believed could not be taken from it. The men who brought the charges, Melius, who was young and apparently sincere, Anhius, who was influential, Lycon, whose name has survived mainly because it was attached to this proceeding, were not entirely wrong that Socrates had been a disruptive presence. The disruption was precisely the point. Whether it was the disruption of corruption or the disruption of honest scrutiny depended on a question the trial would not quite succeed in settling. Scholars who have read the documents carefully tend to see beneath the formal religious charges something more tangled and political. Socrates had taught, in the sense that he had talked at length and with great care, men who had later done harm to Athens, men associated with the oligarchs who had briefly and brutally replaced the democracy. Whether he was responsible for what his interlocutors became was a question his accusers were not permitted by law to raise directly, an amnesty having been declared for offenses committed before a certain date. So they raised the charges that were available. The case was legal. The law was the law, and yet the law, as Socrates well knew, and had always known, was not the same thing as justice. When he began to speak in his own defense, the court heard something it had not quite expected. The conventions of such proceedings called for appeals to the jury's sympathy, for weeping if one could manage it, for parading one's children before the assembly, to remind the jurors that real families would suffer the consequences of their verdict, for promising to be quieter in the future, to cause less trouble, to find some way of being useful to the city rather than persistently difficult. These conventions were not merely theatrical. They reflected a genuine understanding of how democratic assemblies moved, how collective sentiment could be managed by a skilled enough speaker. Socrates had watched enough proceedings to know exactly what was expected. He did not do any of it. He spoke in his ordinary voice, the same voice he had used in the Agora for decades, unhurried, careful, following a line of argument where it went without concern for where it was convenient to arrive. He told the court what he had been doing all his life, and why. He described his investigation of the city's wise men, the politicians, the poets, the craftsmen, each of whom had turned out, on examination, to know considerably less than he believed he knew. He explained without apology that this investigation had made him unpopular. He acknowledged that he would probably be convicted. He stated that his philosophical practice was not something he could give up on the city's request, because it was not a preference or a habit, but the whole of what he understood a human life to be for. There is a passage in the Apology where he imagines the jury offering him a deal. The case could be dropped, the jurors might say, if he simply agreed to stop these conversations of his, to put down the questions and move through the rest of his life, leaving everyone's assumptions undisturbed. He imagined himself turning this offer down. He imagined saying that he would obey a divine instruction before a human one, that as long as he was capable of the work, he would not stop doing it, that every day until his last he would go on doing the thing he had always done, stopping a man in the street, sitting with him, asking what he meant by virtue, asking whether he was certain, asking what happened to that certainty when it met an honest question. His refusal was not heated. It did not arrive with the temperature of defiance. It arrived with the temperature of a man stating something he has understood for so long that stating it requires no effort, not a choice, but a description. The examined life was not an achievement he had managed. It was the only shape a life seemed to take when a person actually looked at what they were doing. He compared himself in this passage to Achilles, to the warrior who had been told he could live long in obscurity or die young and be remembered, and who had chosen the death that meant something over the life that did not. The comparison was not quite direct. Socrates was not claiming to be heroic in that sense, not positioning himself in the old warrior tradition. He was reaching for something more precise, that a life lived in fear of death, arranged to avoid death at any cost, was already a kind of diminishment, that the fear of death was itself a false wisdom, a pretense of knowing that death was the worst possible outcome, when in fact no one had ever looked at death from the inside and reported back on what it was. The person who arranged their entire life around avoiding what they did not actually understand was not being prudent. They were being, in the most technical sense Socrates could bring to bear, irrational. The jury voted. The margin was not enormous. 280 voted to convict, 220 to acquit. He was found guilty. The next stage of the proceeding required Socrates to propose a penalty, since his accusers had proposed death, and the jury now had to decide between that and whatever counter-proposal the defendant offered. What he proposed, initially, was maintenance in the Prytaneum, the city's public dining hall, where Athens honored its great benefactors. He suggested this not, he was careful to say, as a joke, but because it was the honest answer to the question of what he deserved from the city. It was the kind of answer that could only have arrived from a man who had given up performing for the room he was in. The jury was not in the mood for it. The final vote for death was larger than the vote for guilt. He was taken. The execution was deferred for reasons connected to a sacred vessel that had set out for Delos on a religious journey. No executions to be carried out until it returned. He spent the time in prison. This is the part that his friends found very difficult, and that Socrates found, as far as one can tell, exactly like any other stretch of time. Crito came to the prison early one morning. He came before the guards were fully awake, and he sat with Socrates while the city outside continued in its ordinary rhythms, the carts moving, the doors opening, the smoke beginning to rise from the cook fires near the harbor. Crito was one of Socrates' oldest friends, and he had spent the interval since the sentencing working quietly and efficiently to arrange an escape. The plan was in place. The money had been collected. The people who needed to be paid were willing to be paid. It was, Crito believed, simply a matter of Socrates agreeing to go. Socrates listened to all of this. He asked questions in his customary way. He did not dismiss the plan or treat it as unworthy of serious examination. He took Crito's argument that it would be a betrayal of his friends, of his sons, of the people who loved him, to stay when he could go, and he engaged it with the same careful attention he had brought to every argument he had ever encountered. He asked what the principle was, the one underneath the practical considerations. He asked whether the fact that a judgment had been unjust changed what one owed to the system that had issued it. He asked whether a person who had spent his life claiming that the soul was worth more than the body, that integrity was worth more than safety, could now arrange his survival by an act that contradicted everything he had ever said. Then he did something characteristic. He stepped back from the first-person argument entirely and gave the principle a voice. He let the laws of Athens speak directly, not the specific unjust verdict, but the laws and the civic arrangement, and the whole structure of agreement that had made his life in this city possible. What would those laws say if they could speak? They would say that he had benefited from the arrangement his entire life, that he had had the opportunity to leave if the arrangement had not suited him, that he had stayed, and by staying had accepted something, that to slip away now because this one decision went against him was to unmake the entire long agreement retroactively. It was to say that he had been honoring the laws when they served him, and that he honored them now only as long as they continued to serve him, which was not honor, but the appearance of it. This argument has attracted a great deal of careful attention in the centuries since it was set down. Some philosophers have felt its force entirely. Others have wondered whether Socrates drew the obligation too broadly, whether there is a meaningful difference between obeying law in general and accepting an unjust verdict in particular, whether a state that had just killed an innocent man could still coherently claim the loyalty of that man's last hours. The argument has not been settled. It is one of the places where careful reading keeps producing genuine difficulty rather than resolution. Socrates himself knew where his argument reached and where it stopped. He was not claiming to have solved the general problem of political obligation. He was claiming to know what he owed in this specific situation, having lived this specific life, having said what he had always said about justice and the soul. The principle at the center of it was older than the argument about the laws. It was the one he had held longest, that one must never respond to injustice with injustice, that if it is wrong to do something, it remains wrong regardless of what has been done to the person being tempted to do it. That wrongdoing harms the one who does wrong, in the most serious possible sense, damages the soul, which is the only part of a person that Socrates consistently regarded as genuinely at stake in any moral situation. He had been saying this in the streets for decades. He was now simply living it, which was what he had always said the saying required. Crito went home, and the arrangements that would not be used were quietly and with some sadness set aside. The daemonian, the inner sign, the something that had guided him, or rather the something that had periodically prevented him from going in certain directions, had been part of his life for as long as he could remember. He described it as a kind of voice, though not a voice precisely, something more like a check, a restraint that arose at moments when he was about to go wrong. It never told him what to do. It only at certain junctures indicated that a particular path was closed. He had described it to his interlocutors and to the court with his usual directness, knowing that the description would make him sound unusual, not particularly caring. The daimonion had raised questions for philosophers ever since. It sat oddly in a philosophy committed to reason and examination, this private signal, this inner check that did not explain itself. It was probably one of the things Meletus had in mind with the charge about new divine beings. What Socrates said at his trial about the daimonion and the morning of the proceeding was that it had not intervened, that on this particular morning, as he walked through the city toward the court, the check had not arisen, that the path had, in its usual sense, remained open. He took this not as indifference, but as a kind of agreement, as if whatever the daimonion was had looked at what was happening and had found it, in its way, acceptable. He was walking in the right direction. The morning was ordinary. The olives were at their stalls. The question was still open, and he was still himself, still walking toward it, barefoot on the stones he had walked on all his life. The day of the execution was also quiet. His friends had come, most of them, and they were struggling with the morning in the way that people struggle with things they cannot change and have tried very hard not to accept. Socrates had slept, apparently. This detail has stayed in the accounts because it was not what his friends expected. They expected to find a man who had spent the night in the condition they were in, awake, restless, moving through the hours with the kind of full-body awareness that comes when the body knows something is coming. He had slept. He was, when they arrived, the calmest person in the room. He spent the last hours in conversation. This is the part that the Phaedo records with the most care, not the grief of his friends, though that is there, present in the margins of every sentence, in the way the dialogue keeps noting who was crying, who had to leave the room, who found it impossible to look directly at what was happening and remain composed. The conversation itself was about the soul, about whether the soul survived the body, and on what grounds one might believe that it did. Socrates moved through a series of arguments, examined them carefully, acknowledged where they fell short, pushed further. He was not performing confidence. He was doing what he had always done, following a question where it honestly went. The argument that seemed to satisfy him most was not a proof in any technical sense. It rested on the claim that life and death were opposites, that opposites came from one another in the way that sleeping came from waking, and waking from sleep, and that if this was so, then just as the living came from the dead, something of what had lived must persist when life was over. He knew this argument was not airtight. He acknowledged this. He said that certainty about such things was probably beyond what a living person could achieve. But he also said that the belief that the soul was worth more than the body, that the philosophical life, the life of careful attention to truth, had not been a mistake, seemed to him, after everything, more worth living with than its opposite. There is a specific moment in the account of his last hours that has the quality of something one wants to stay with for a while. He had been talking for a long time. The hemlock would need to be prepared. One of the jailers came to tell him this, and the jailer's own distress was visible. The man had been bringing Socrates water throughout the period of the trial and the imprisonment, and he had come to feel something for this strange, patient, unhurried man who never seemed to need anything to be different. The jailer delivered his message and turned quickly away. Socrates watched him go and said to the room that the man was kind. This was the observation, the quiet noticing of a stranger's kindness on the last day of everything, with the same attention he had always given to whatever was in front of him. He bathed. He asked that the hemlock be brought when he was ready for it, rather than waiting until the sun had fully set, because the extra time would not change anything, and he had no particular attachment to the extra time. When it came, he drank it without ceremony, in the manner of a man completing something, and then he walked. The accounts say walked, back and forth across the room, until his legs grew heavy, and then he lay down. His last words, as Plato recorded them, were a request that a small debt be paid, a rooster owed to Asclepius, the god of healing. The request has been interpreted in many ways over the centuries. Some have heard in it a final, characteristically ironic gesture that death was a healing, a cure from the long illness of embodied life. Others have heard it simply as the careful completion of an obligation, the sort of thing a man who had always taken his commitments seriously would make sure to settle before he was no longer in a position to settle anything. Both readings can be true at once. Socrates tended to work that way, saying things that meant what they said, and also at a slight angle meant something else, something the listener had to turn toward themselves to find. What persists, after all the arguments about the soul, and the laws, and the charges, and the vote, is not quite what one might expect. It is not the image of a martyr. It is not the image of a man who knew he was right and died for it. Martyrdom requires a more settled certainty than Socrates ever claimed to possess. He died, not for the conviction that he was right, but for the principle that honest inquiry is more important than personal safety, which is a slightly different thing, a thing with more intellectual humility in it. He did not know, in the end, whether the soul survived. He did not know whether the gods were as he suspected. He did not know what death would bring. He had opinions, some of them carefully reasoned and held with more confidence than others, and he had lived his entire life on the ground that not knowing, when it was honest not knowing, was the most accurate position one could occupy. The question that he asked in the agora, at dinner parties, in the gymnasium, in the street, to generals and poets and craftsmen and young men and old men who stopped long enough to be questioned, was always, in some form, the same question. Not how much the person knew, or what honors they had accumulated, or whether they had been successful in the world's terms, something more interior than that, something that required the other person to look, honestly and without the comfort of assumed answers, at the life they were actually living, the choices they were actually making, the values they were actually enacting in the days that added up to what they had become, whether they had looked, whether they had asked, whether the life they were living had been, in that specific sense, examined. He did not offer a completed answer. This is one of the things that separates his philosophical practice from what most people, when they imagine a wise old philosopher, expect. The wise old philosopher of the imagination has answers. He has arrived somewhere. He has looked at the question long enough that he can now offer the seeker what the seeker was seeking. Socrates offered no such thing. He offered the question itself, made more precise through conversation, stripped of the easy answers that people had previously believed sufficient. The offering was not an arrival, it was a beginning. Plato wrote it all down. The dialogues began to circulate in the years after Socrates died, among the people who had known him, and the people who had known people who had known him, and then further into the world that Plato himself would not live to see, into other cities, other languages, other centuries. The arguments moved with them. The specific image of Socrates moved with them. The barefoot man, the broad nose, the patient attention, the question. Philosophers and schools that came after him would take pieces of what he had said and build large systematic things from them. Others would take the method rather than the conclusions and use it differently. Others would read the dialogues centuries after they were written and find in them something that still had not been used up. This is not because Socrates had solved anything exactly. The questions he asked about justice and virtue and the good life have not, since his time, been answered in the way that a mathematical problem gets answered and then is no longer a problem. They have been answered again and again in different ways by people working from different starting points, and each answer has produced new versions of the question. The conversation has not concluded. It has accumulated, which is a different thing, more complex, more layered, more densely populated, with good arguments that each partially illuminate what the others partially miss. What Socrates contributed to this conversation was a particular discipline of attention, not a doctrine, not a school, not a set of conclusions that could be adopted and recited, a practice, the practice of not letting an easy answer pass unchallenged, not as a form of argument for argument's sake, but out of a genuine belief that the unchallenged answer, the assumed answer, the comfortable answer carried forward without examination, that this was how most of the real damage in human life got done. People going badly wrong, not because they were wicked, but because they had never looked carefully at what they were actually doing, and why, and whether it was what they would choose if they had looked. The city of Athens went on, as cities do. The agora continued to fill in the mornings, with vendors and lawyers and philosophers, and men arguing about politics, and men arranging business, and men who had simply come to buy bread, and found themselves drawn into a conversation they had not anticipated. The Parthenon remained on the hill above it. the light continued to fall on the stone in the way that it falls in Attica, pale and specific and briefly strange,